All right, so for those of you that don't know the background, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a minute, but I've been involved with the Higgins labor program since I relocated to South Bend from Las Vegas 5 years ago. And the first call I made was actually to Dan Graff and introduced myself, and I started to come to the Labor Cafe, and I look back and 5 years in the rearview mirror, and here I am as a community fellow. So I thank you for welcoming and thank you for the support. And it's been a really great honor to be involved with the Just Wage Initiative and to have discussions about the Just Wage Framework. And that really is the foundation for what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm a 81 grad. And as Dave said, I'm a community fellow here for the Center for Social Concerns, focused with the Higgins Labor Program. I'm also a labor mediator with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, but I need to make clear I'm not representing my agency. I'm representing myself, and my agency is part of my background. And this is a very important disclaimer. So, so we're going to talk about promoting a just wage economy through mediation. And so, as I said, I've been with the FMCS for now a little over 19 years, which I never thought, first of all, I'd work for the federal government, let alone they'd let me stay. So it's been a wonderful career. I began as a field mediator, working with labor organizations and employers to resolve labor relations conflict and to manage labor relations conflict. So conflict management has been my background, and it's just been a wonderful gift to be charged with being a peacemaker each day. So that is really wonderful. So I feel like I haven't worked a day in 19 years. I've just been able to be myself in service of other people. And I've transitioned now to be a mediation technology specialist, where my focus is on looking at technological strategies and developing things and people to employ technology more effectively in their mediation practices. So that can be from remote meeting platforms to different things where you can engage people through technological means. And the other thing, what I'm really actually most proud of, and that's why I went to the top, is it'll be in July, or actually June, it'll be 5 years ago, we started the Hawkins Family Foundation. And our foundation was created to promote literacy with children that are under-resourced and consequently underserved. So we've had a 5-year relationship with Coquillard Elementary on the west side. And we've been providing over the course of the year, 12 events, literacy events, where the kids can work on both their literacy skills and artistic expression, which has been a great, great gift for us. And during over the course of the pandemic, we were able to raise funds for children that are food insecure. Because a lot of the children, as many of us know, their nutrition comes from the free or reduced lunches that are available at school. So what do they do when school's not in session? What do they do on the breaks? Well, we certainly don't want children to be hungry. So we've incorporated that as part of what we do with our foundation. So the Just Wage Framework is the foundation of what we're going to talk about today. And although I'm presenting, I also see myself as a facilitator of conversation. You're not empty vessels. And so I don't want to treat you as empty vessels, so I'm not talking at you. I want you to participate. So if I ask questions, that actually means it's the audience participation part of the program. Okay. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Just Wage Framework, let's look at this, because I think it's super, super important. The just wage enables a decent life, enables asset building. It provides basic social security for the worker in the household. It provides a wage which is non-discriminatory, it is not excessive, and it reflects the participation by the worker, and it considers performance, qualification, and type of work. So as I look at this framework, when Dan first told me about it, I was like, this makes complete sense. And this should be a foundation for conversation and build on that. But there are challenges with this in the business world, and there are challenges with this in collective bargaining. So we're going to talk a little bit about my experiences. I want to hear some of your experiences and some of your thoughts with regard to the just wage framework and its applicability in the business world. So the economic discussion, it is fraught with peril. And these are the things that I've experienced. I want to ask if you've experienced any of these things. When you've had thought about having an economic discussion with an employer, has there been tension involved? Yeah, quite often.
Just a little.
Anxiety, yes, because I know I've been in there. I want to go in, I want to ask for a raise, and all of a sudden I've got this pit in my stomach. Frustration when I didn't get what I need, not necessarily what I wanted, but what I felt that I needed or deserved based on my contributions and my knowledge, skills, and abilities. There can be a degree of competitiveness in that conversation between the employer and the employee. There are also politics, which are generally away from that discussion, certainly insert themselves in that discussion in the background, as well as personality conflicts. Have you ever worked for somebody or worked with somebody that you just didn't get along with, and yet you still have to have that conversation economically? And then conflicting perceptions and personalities and or priorities, and that actually speaks directly to the conflict management of the labor and management priorities and the labor and management perceptions. And quite often, this is divisive and a real killer of morale. Would you agree? Yes. So now this is the audience participation part of the program. And from your perspective, because I know my perspective, I want to hear yours. What are some of the underlying causes of difficulties with the economic discussion? And I think this is found in what are the concerns of the employer and what are the concerns of labor. So what do you think are some of the causes of these underlying disabilities, the causes of the tension, the anxiety, the conflicts?
Certainly the employer is concerned about, sustainability, and that would embrace whether it's a for-profit or a non-profit entity, but the employer with accountability to multiple stakeholders for the viability and sustainability of the enterprise. That's number one, I think, for the employer.
Equitable power dynamics.
Please expand on that.
So I think that you're looking at the person who's asking for the raise. They might not feel empowered, or that their position is at stake by asking, or even that the identities that they possess create dynamics that create the inequity for pursuing that raise or whatever circumstances.
All of a sudden, fear is part of the equation. Yeah. Fear and intimidation. Anybody else?
I think it's also true that employers are acutely sensitive to the signals they send by the decisions they make, and that at least some of them are rather defensive. They feel as if they yield on a certain point that it will be a slippery slope, and pretty soon they will lose control of the situation. Whereas the employee may just be looking for a concession on a single issue because it's a major issue to him or her.
Yeah, it's true. The employee quite often is looking at this snapshot of my life.
Right.
And this affects this certain aspect of my life. And somehow that's threatening to the employer's perception of control.
Kevin, when I look at that slide, just kind of define, take a look at employer. Is that employer, or is it owner?
Can be either.
Yeah, because I think there's a difference maybe between the two.
Oh,
So
well,
maybe-
please, Prof, expand on your thought.
Yeah, because let's say an employer may just be, let's say, a certain level within an organization. Okay, so maybe you're talking about a supervisor, maybe you're talking about the department head, maybe now you're talking about a division manager versus an owner who's basically looking down at the entire organization. So sometimes those concerns are a little bit different for a staff person versus an ownership person. Ownership person is a little bit more return on capital, and let's say staff person's more return.
Mhm. What are your thoughts? I think that's an excellent point on what Professor Holmes just raised.
This may be a little too cynical, but the vast number of American employers, really, employees are just a cost. And that's it. They might make some, some things around the edges, concessions in terms of getting a voice from the employees. Basically, most employers think employees are a cost. It has to be managed, manage turnover, et cetera.
So we're real keen on the employer, right? Go ahead. I'm sorry, you had your hand.
No, I was gonna say that I think what you mentioned is going into the power dynamics that I was speaking to. And so I think if you are an entry-level employee versus somebody who's senior, that you might feel like you don't have a voice to advocate for yourself, or that you're undeserving of a raise versus somebody who has higher stake in the organization or company and could maybe have that power placement more easily than that entry-level employee.
Once the employee has not only his or her sort of professional career, but probably family and others who are kind of behind the scenes and are at the mercy of whatever that decision is, right? You might not necessarily talk to colleagues about going up, but you're talking to your family about having this conversation for sure. And they're, it's not just your professional identity, but your value in your home and that sort of thing. There's a lot of emotion and personal risk and stake, I think, in that moment, what happens for that employee.
Yeah, it's often for the employee, I'm working without a net here,
Yeah.
And the concerns and what you were talking about, a lot of those things I think are encompassed by just simply thinking about quality of life. Because the consequences of this conversation definitely have a ripple effect on my quality of life. So what concerns, we highlight the differences, but what do you think there are any concerns that labor and an employer have in common with regard to the economic discussion?
Certainly think that too often there's a sense amongst employers that workers aren't thinking about viability and long-term sustainability, but that is something that both sides share.
Mhm.
And aspect of the continuity of the enterprise that benefits all. I think both share, whether it's just under the law or in spirit, an obligation for fairness, and but that gets interpreted in all sorts of ways and points back to this, engagement of the power dynamic, which isn't solely employer worker, but is infused with all sorts of dynamics and histories that come into play. But I think fairness is something that they have in common, whether they see it, that fairness the same way.
Dan, you raise an excellent point, and this is something I realized in my conflict management aspect of my practice was when I introduced the word fair, I was inadvertently introducing a point of conflict because of the as you alluded to, the interpretation based on my perspective of what is fair and what is unfair. So then it made me change my vocabulary to reasonable, equitable, and think about feasible, and think about affordable, and these type of things, and remove fair, because then I could start to look at facts rather than feelings. And once you introduce feelings to the economic discussion, it's very easy for it to take a left turn.
There's a loaded term. I was gonna use the word equitable too, just thinking about how I think both parties would believe that they would want something equitable. And that perception is the hard part.
And equitability, Felicia, from my perspective, is that it takes into account the concern that Dan raised about sustainability of the enterprise. And it takes into account your point about my quality of life. And then we start to compete over which is more important. And I try and not feature that and talk about what is most reasonable in this situation, what respects each perspective. So the thing that Prof was talking about is return on investment. I think that is probably the key thing that the parties, key concern that they have in common is realizing a return on the investment. However, the perspective of investment is different. So from the labor side, what do you think is their perspective of investment in the enterprise?
They would take a look at time, they would take a look at effort, they would take a look at the sacrifices that they can make in the basis. That's the thing, that's what it's more.
You know, and I 100% agree. What's the return on my investment of time, my knowledge, my skills, my abilities, my loyalty?
The opportunity cost, like work somewhere else. Why am I here?
No, I saw it when I was working in Las Vegas quite often. In Las Vegas, the guest room attendants make a higher wage than you'll see in any other place in the country, because the economy is so based on the service industry. But at the same time, there's a smaller pool of people from whom to get guest room attendants. So the competition is fierce. And people will go across the street for another quarter an hour. We talk about opportunity. But then they'll go, and then the environment is different, the culture is different. And then what's that quarter an hour really worth? So those are the things when you think about that return on the investment from the labor side. But those are, that's really, really important. And I don't think employers often consider that return on investment perspective of their labor force. Now let's talk about the return on investment from the employer's point of view. What's important to the employer? Again, audience participation, part of the program.
Productivity.
Results.
Can you find return on investment from let's say from accountants and for managers? You would say you are there is a assignment of assets based on a disposal for individual. And the assets could be time, also investment and money. So you're taking a look at, I've made this investment in my employees or my division. I expect a return, and the return can be defined as either a percentage, let's say I need a 10% return if I make an investment in total assets. Excuse me, $100,000, I expect $10,000 back as a return. You know, just, I'm just using it as a benchmark, but that's kind of what you look at. So I put funds in, or assets in, or my skills in. That's something.
It does seem to me, Kevin, that a lot of times the negotiations over return on investment, say, or any numbers that are generated and basically maintained by the employer or the organization. Oftentimes workers are discouraged from thinking about the overall enterprise. Just think as yourself and what you need and where you're at and what more are you hoping to get. So I think that's kind of interesting, like thinking about multiple stakeholders here. There's not just a power imbalance, but often information or knowledge imbalance that a lot of times I think employers want to maintain. Like a lot of what I've read about the United Auto Workers attempts to transform the auto industry in negotiations with General Motors in the post-war era. the UAW's counterparts at the table constantly try to get away from discussing what's the proper division of the spoils. You just think about what your group needs. And let's build from that, not what that relationship is to what stockholders are getting or expecting, or what we're going to plow in the line to do. So I'm really intrigued by this notion of some common terms and attempts to get sides to see commonalities, but the differences in power as well as a sort of understanding of those definitions.
Well, Dan, I think you're right on. I think there's a resistance to complete transparency in that regard. Because if there was complete transparency in that regard, and people saw what the return on investment is for the stockholders, or what the upper management salaries are, or how much we're putting in R&D, and what percentage, because it is, and as you were talking about earlier, this is what we're putting into labor, period, the end. And it's a percentage of our investment. That way, you don't have to humanize it. And so for me as the mediator, how do I penetrate that in a conversation? So then, and I know that I can't do that in general session at the table. Because if I do that in general session at the table, the employer will feel I cut them off at the knees. And that will affect my acceptability going forward to the employer. Now labor will be like, yes, dude, finally. So what I have to do is go into separate caucus and tug at the heartstrings of the employer. But then I have to go into separate caucus with labor and talk business to labor. And to see, based on what I gleaned from those separate conversations, if I can find that sweet spot. It ain't always easy.
How, can I ask you a question, Kevin?
Yes.
Related to that, how often in these sorts of mediated negotiations, is it the norm that the sides have an understanding that this is a process that's just covering the next couple of years maybe, but it's not the end? Is that often the way they go in on this, or is there often a sort of like everything is up for grabs now and it's an all or nothing? I'm just sort of thinking about the routinization of it, or the understanding that, you know, or how much you have to play the role to get people to see this is this moment. We'll be back here again in 3 years.
The answer is it depends.
Yeah.
You know, and you'll find a lot with mediation, the answer is it depends in labor relations. It depends on the situation, it depends on the market, the state of the union with regard to what the employer's making, the state of the union with regard to the union. Is it an election year? You know, are people trying to, you know, maintain their power bases in both places? What are the politics that are involved here? Who is looking to be upwardly mobile in either the labor side or the employer side? Who promised what to somebody? Because often promises are made, and those promises are made away from the table, but they directly affect my behavior at the table. Because if I don't deliver upon which I promised, somebody else's butt may be sitting in my seat, or I may get myself unelected and somebody else will be in leadership. So those are all those dynamics, but I guess to hone in on your question, I have to, as a mediator, I have to try and ferret out all of those things as part of the dynamic.
So you are underpaid. No matter what you make.
I'm taking the fifth.
So Kevin, do you do that during, like, before you get folks together, or how does that parroting happen in your process?
Well, traditionally in mediation, the parties will reach an impasse and they quit talking to each other, or they're not communicating. I can't hear you, or I don't want to hear you. So they said, well, call a mediator, and the mediator is supposed to function as a conduit for communication to encourage cooler heads to prevail and bring in an objective viewpoint. So traditionally in my practice, I would parachute in when, you know, the bombs had gone off, bazookas had been fired, everything else is going on from a business standpoint. And then I've got to say, okay, let's clear the rubble and let's see if we can find peace, you know. As I think about this, and I'll talk about this later in our discussion, is it's become increasingly evident to me that this conversation, or the foundation of this conversation, should happen long before we go to the table. Because once we get to that part of loggerheads, it's very hard to get people to listen. And then it's hard because of all the different things that Dan raised, all those different aspects of the conversation.
Kevin, when you get called in, a lot of times, you know, it's a difference of opinion. So you're a mediator.
No,
Right? I mean, sometimes you're called in and folks want somebody to come in and make a decision. That's not what you're doing.
no, that's a great point. I am not laying down any rulings on this is how this should be resolved. I may see where the sweet spot is early on, but I have to ascertain whether or not they're ready to hear it at that point. Because quite often I will sit with one party, I'll go into a general session, I'll hear them lay it out. I'll say, let's take a caucus. I'll go into one room and I'll ask them specific questions. I'll go into another room, ask them specific questions, and I'll take some time myself to meditate on what I've heard. And I go, here's where the deal is. Now, if I call them back into general session, I say, here's where the deal is, and they're not ready to hear it, that's just gone out the window and I have to start over. So a lot of it is instinct, a lot of it is timing. You have to understand the dynamics of the relationship, how far things have escalated, and you have to find out who's promised what and what their motivations are. So it does become artistic at a point. Yes.
Yeah, so if you get called in when it's already at an impasse,
Mhm.
what's your process look like to get people to open up a little bit and break that down?
I show them my true face. because it begins with me. I want them to feel I'm a safe person that they can trust. So then I tell them a little bit about myself. I tell them who I am, where I come from, the things I enjoy. I start to humanize myself rather than I'm from the government and I'm here to help. You know, I come in and, I'm Kevin Hawkins. I'm just a guy. I've got a family. I have a life. I have this, I have that. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And then people start to relax a little bit. But every mediator is not the same. This is my style. Every mediator has a different style. So, if you ever go into mediation, odds are you're not going to get me. You're going to get whoever you get. That doesn't mean that their approach is ineffective and mine is effective. Oftentimes it depends on the parties and the situation. I just know I want to get a rhythm. Mediation and negotiations have a rhythm. And so what you want to do is create a rhythm toward agreement. So we play the music. And if we're playing the music and I introduce something here on the downbeat and it should not be there, then the music stops. And what happens is the negotiations take a rhythm and then one of the parties will introduce that wrong step. And that's what leads to the impasse. Great questions. Great questions. Thank you. So how does the mediator find common ground and build on it to reach a reasonable and equitable economic agreement? You have to listen. You have to ask questions. You have to understand where they're coming from. You have to surface the politics. You have to surface the personalities. You have to surface the promises. And you have to surface the goals. Because each party has a goal. We want to reach this number. This is where we're comfortable. And I have to know that. Then I have to push them off it. Right? Or not. Because I look at their perspective and the reasonableness of their perspective. And if they have a reasonable perspective, then I have to be able to illustrate the reasonableness and the equitability of that perspective to the other party. Because they're not hearing it from this party. So I'm guiding them to the sweet spot where we bow and we say, thank you for the dance. That's kind of how it works. Yes.
You were talking about mediators with different approaches like yourself.
Mhm.
It's a basic question. Can either party at some point dismiss the mediator in hopes of finding another one?
Oh, quite often they have. You told me something I didn't want to hear. You're out, pal. I remember very early in my career, there was an initial contract, and I didn't know this, but the labor rep had overpromised what they could gain from the initial contract. And so I made the mistake because I was inexperienced. I didn't have a conversation with the union rep beforehand. So when I was asked the question, I told them what I thought about the reasonableness of that perspective in achieving an initial contract. And it did not agree with what they were told by the labor rep. So as if by magic, I disappeared. And the guy didn't talk to me for almost 10 years. Yeah, they call it breaking your pick. So then all of a sudden, he thought about training and he called me. I go, dude, who are you? He said, can you come back and do this for me? And so you have to be careful. And you have to be patient. And you can be well-intentioned, but still have a case of hoof and mouth. So you have to really be measured and stop and think before you speak.
Sorry.
No, so in that situation, what I should have done, when they asked me the question, I said, well, I should have put it on them. What do you think it should be? What does your labor rep think it should be? That would have been the proper approach. Then I would have known. Because they were hoping for more than, than I told them what was real. Dan?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask how often and then how do you deal with the internal issues or cliques or conflicts within a side? That seemed like that would be really hard. If your goal is to bring the two formally opposed sides together, if they're internally divided. I was thinking this initially from the labor side, which unions are ostensibly democratic organizations. They would, it's obvious they would be riven with, potentially riven with all sorts of factions and disagreements that get surfaced. I was thinking less so on management side because it's inherently hierarchical and there are bosses but it's probably the same. So I wonder how often do you see that divisions internally surfacing that then you have to somehow try to deal with that too, or is that impossible?
Oh, it's funny you bring it up because often it's quite apparent. Because the lead negotiator will say something and then somebody else will speak offhand and I'm like, oh, because that's in direct conflict with what they said. And then I'll utilize the sidebar. And the sidebar is when I will take the lead negotiators from one party or another, or the lead negotiators together away from their parties and talk to them frankly about what's going on. So I'm like, in that situation, I would say, hey, Dan, what's going on internally? Because you said this, and I had this other person basically contravene what you were saying. And I want to know, do you have a dynamic that we need to deal with? And then if we do, then we may have to orchestrate something. Not being disingenuous to the process, but to get that person in line or that faction in line.
How many people are typically in the two parties?
There is no typical. It depends on the size of the bargaining unit. You could go to healthcare and there are people that are techs, they're custodial, they're nurses, there's all, administrative people, and you can have huge multi-stakeholders within the labor side. And you also have all these different departments that correspond to these labor stakeholders. So you can have a large one, you could have 4 people at the table. It just depends on the nature of the business. Yes.
I think Jay had a question for me, so.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Jay.
Actually, I have 2 questions. And now I'm only gonna ask one. So really appreciate the point you made about the common ground. So interested in how you experience the identities of the parties, and then the motivated reasoning around their identities versus the reasonableness of the argument. So there got to be some, reasoning that I'm the builder of this company, so I'm going to find reasons that, even if it isn't economic, right? So even if it doesn't make financial sense, and on the other side as well, investment loyalty, etc. So how do you deal with the identities that the people that move to reason?
The answer for me is I try not to deal with identities. What I ask them to do is look at their perspective.
Okay.
And I say, in your preparation, see if you can poke holes in your perspective.
Nice.
You know what you want to do. You're very clear on that. Make the other side's argument.
Excellent.
And let's see if you can expose any faults in your perspective. So basically, what I'm encouraging them to do is now let's stop advocating and let's have some objectivity in our perception.
My question actually goes into that,
Yes,
active identities, and I guess, and so feel free to push back on this, it might be a little bit overgeneralized, but, I'm really curious about the culture of mediation in your industry and just, thinking about the most marginalized people who need an advocate of a mediator. Like say it is a migrant migrant farmer, coalition or union. How prominent is it that people have access to mediators? What are like the factors in general that make it accessible for organizations, groups, that are like smaller and lower represented, having access to mediation?
well, if you're engaged in collective bargaining, you can avail yourself of the services of the agency for which I work. What you have to do, if you have an intent to bargain, you have to file what is called an F7, which is a notice of intent to bargain. And that's sent to our agency. And then those notices of intent to bargain are disseminated to mediators throughout the country. And then they will contact the different bargaining units about, you know, what they want to do with bargaining if they feel they're ready or want a mediator. Because both parties have to agree to mediation. We can't impose our services. So both parties, and this is the difficult part, because a lot of in labor and in traditional conflict management, people say, well, we don't need a mediator until we can't talk to each other. That doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense is let's set a table that's better and utilize an objective eye to help us build a foundation. Then we can manage our own relationship, because I'm leaving. It's your relationship. You have to manage it. You have to create it. But I'm here to help you create it. And that's the conciliation piece that's so important. Because a lot of times they don't even know how to talk to each other. So, but there's so many different types of mediation now. Mediation is in the court system now because they're trying to save money on litigation and time and everything. So from divorce to different contract, to all of these different things, there's many. Dave, how are you? All right, he's a classmate of mine. He's also this is Dave. So when we're looking at that, I think mediation is a great alternative because it's an opportunity for conversation and for both parties to have a stake in crafting what the terms and conditions of our relationship going forward. Because if you have them imposed, there's generally resentment because there's a winner and a loser. And sometimes they used to say, well, if people leave mediation and they're both pissed off, you've done your job. Because you've made them both feel a little bit of pain to get to a reasonable area. But also what they teach us, Lou, in mediation is that if you want the agreement more than the parties, then the parties aren't the problem. You are the problem. So I have to be able to go home and sleep, whether they're being wonderfully cooperative or being incredibly intransigent. It's their deal, and they're going to act the way they want to act. And I have to be able to let that go.
This question is really interesting. Your service, Kevin, right, in some ways presupposes a healthy and vigorous collective bargaining based economy, and you only have 6% of the American workforce now in unions, at least unions with contracts. So because I've been spinning out in my head, what if you applied this kind of labor mediation outside of that framework, right? Like my goal is to bring back that kind of regime where workers have much more protections and voice, but But it's just interesting thinking about all alternate scenarios where you have a wonderfully disinterested yet justice-focused mediator like Kevin Hawkins. But of course, that, as you said, raises all sorts of scary questions about the role of the government in solving problems. But
You know, if I could get into every conversation, I would, you know. But we have, you know, we have parameters that are set forth for our agency. But outside of that, to try and foster some conversations so labor and employers can understand each other better. And we're seeing with the pandemic, in my perception, something of a shift, because I never would have thought that Starbucks would have organized, you know, and different places like that there's a push at Amazon to organize. I mean, those things, I'm not an advocate for unionization, I'm an advocate for the collective bargaining process. That's, and our agency supports the collective bargaining process. And I think that that's important to be able to see the value of it. And it's often difficult for employers to see the value of it because they feel they're ceding control. And then you think about a partnership model, which in different places around the world has proven to be very profitable and very productive. But it would represent a great cultural shift from where we are after centuries. So how can an advocate for a party, if I'm representing labor, if I'm representing management, how can an advocate find common ground and build on it? Or should an advocate try and find common ground? Or is your responsibility stop with loyalty to your party? Now it's getting quiet.
Are you asking about political parties or?
I'm talking about not.
I know, no, I know.
Well,
what
I
you
think,
mean.
no,
But it's
it
the
could be
same
political,
logic.
yes.
I think it needs some work, the kind of work that you do across political parties as well. I digress.
No, I don't think that's a digression at all, because what influences those things are interests away from the table.
Yes.
And part of what the mediator does is to try and surface the interests away from the table
Right.
that affect the tenor of negotiations.
Exactly.
So your point's well found.
I thought your comment earlier about asking, you know, one party to consider the other person's perspective and to walk through it is a really great starting point.
Yeah, I think, and thank you for that, Alicia, because it really is encouraging the advocate to have a degree of humility and look at, am I willing, and it's, let me take a 10,000 foot, 360, whatever you want to call it. Let me take a look at my perspective and try and poke holes in it, because if I do that, I think that is super responsible advocacy, because then you don't have any blind spots. And I want to know and reveal my blind spots. And if the other party has a point, I have to be able to acknowledge that point. And we see in our political process, there's a different reticence to do that. And then what kind of environment do we create? What kind of relationships do we cultivate? It's always a Texas two-step type of thing where nothing gets really addressed, and what is correct, what is the sweet spot? I want to dance around it, because that doesn't taste good to me. You know, I can't wrap my arms around and hug that, but nevertheless, it's the right thing to do. So that's part of what I do also. So, because I'll go to a party and I'll say, hey, can you refute that point? No, they're right. So why are you fighting it? And then this is where the influence away from the table. I've got marching orders. I'm supposed to have this. Well, now I can do something with that. And sometimes I'll say, oh, I'm going to press you on to press that person with the marching orders of the reasonability of those orders. Then it gets real quiet up in there, you know, because then they have to, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because they don't want to humanize. They want to see the silos of the percentages. So the question is, when would be a good time to employ the just wage framework in collective bargaining? I'm working with some colleagues and having a discussion with them. I think the more we can get involved with negotiations on the front end, it is a perfect parachute in spot for the just wage framework. Because then when you talk about all of the aspects of the just wage framework, they're not esoteric. You can actually, and I don't think it's esoteric at all, but it does have a human component to it. Especially because of the foundation is Catholic social teaching. The human component has a place in the conversation. But if I wait until you're stuck on a percentage, it's very hard for me to wedge that in there at that juncture. And it also creates a balance because it's not just human, there are business aspects. When you're talking to a labor organization, is what you're asking for excessive? You know, and we get away from wants and we talk about needs. That is one of the key things. Don't tell me what you want, tell me what you need, and to be able to illustrate that need. And give me options on how that need can be met. You know, and so that's from the labor side. From the employer side, why do you need it to be at this percentage? Because I promised a certain ROI. Well, is that reasonable? Does it take into account the quality of life of the people that are giving you that ROI? You see what I mean? So then I can have a frank conversation about this on the front end in preparation. Because the friction is very hard to smooth out when you get to that impasse point. And then then it's fun with numbers, Prof. We're trying to play with the numbers to get to a place where I feel okay about it and I feel okay. And we're, you know, and then it's like a bam, 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 and it's not a dance. All right. So it has a different feel. Yes.
Have you ever had the experience of trying to do the front end stuff? Because I would say if you tried that, that would be your first and last meeting with the employer. I understand what you're trying to do.
It's I'm kind of sneaky like that. So we'll sit down, let's say we're sitting at the table and I'm like, Dale, you know, where are you thinking you're going to land economically? Well, Dale said, I want that. Well, Dale, how does that take into account the quality of life for the worker? You know, can the worker actually take care of their family? Can they provide a little security? Are they able to build a little wealth? You know, that's how I do it. It's just, I'm not saying here's the framework and answer it ABC 1, 2, 3. I have to weave it into the conversation. And so as I weave that into the conversation, I'm not necessarily going to get agreement, but I'm planting a seed, some food for thought. So And then I'll ask, if this is your percentage, why would they agree to that? Tell me why. Because they're gonna ask you why you need that. Can you tell me why you need that? And why they would agree to meet that need? And that gives me opportunities to weave in all these aspects of adjustment.
Kevin, is this easier to do in terms of startup corporation, a small history, or in longer corporation set in stone, where you've got maybe defined groups that are going back and forth? And where would it be easier as far as mediation? The life cycle of the organization.
Eddie, the answer is it depends.
Thank you.
Like I told, it depends on the heart and the mission of the organization. And because a startup could be just as hard-nosed and quite often very hard-nosed, as evidenced by how long it often takes to get initial agreements. They can be just as hard-nosed as a long-standing organization. Or if leadership changes in a long-standing organization and the heart and the approach to the mission changes, it could be easier. So it just depends. Yes.
Kevin, do you think the framework language works well from the employee side? Does it give them words? Does it give them concepts? Does it give them categories of value and concern? Does it reframe in any way the way they might be able to represent the validity of their ask?
Excellent question. Yeah, well, it prompts me from a labor standpoint is, tell me the reasons behind you're saying you need this.
Define quality of life, right?
Right, define quality of life. Well, this is what rents are. This is what groceries cost. This is what you're charging me for my benefits. All right. These are the costs associated with me having a reasonable quality of life for my family. And what you're offering me does not afford me that. That's how I would do that. Now, based on the research I've done, I would submit to you that this is more reasonable. But I also tell parties, don't come with your best deal the first time out. A lot of times, an employer will anticipate labor is going to ask for the sun, the moon, and the stars. And then they'll be at zero. And we'll meet somewhere in the middle. Don't do that. Because all that leads to is hard feelings, and it's a really long dance, and it's hard to get in rhythm. Get closer to the sweet spot. Not necessarily your best offer, but a reasonable offer. Have 2 or 3 choices in your pocket, ready to go. Let me give you the first one, because you never know. The first one may be where they want to land. You don't know. But you know that, and we saw it with baseball. We started hearing those, and then we finally got to a place where both parties finally hit a spot where they were comfortable. I wouldn't say it's a sweet spot for either, but it was a reasonable spot. But you saw how long and protracted that lockout was. So if I'm preparing in a one-on-one economic discussion, and that's really, I think it's infinitely more difficult to have that one-on-one conversation rather than a collective conversation. But I would prepare in much the same way. You've associated, this is the value for this position, and I get that, it's part of your budget, but do you know the value that you've assessed for this position doesn't afford me a reasonable quality of life? And if they don't care, then you know where you stand, right? And then you have a hard decision to make, but I would want to draw them out to find out where they're at in that one-on-one discussion. Do you think it's important to humanize?
No.
You know, let's see, what a dope. Of course it is, yes.
Well, it strikes me that you are an ethical, moral educator of, but you have to do it, as you said earlier, on the slide or as the moment arises, and you know, you can't come in with a curriculum, and it's a dance for you. And I'm wondering, like, you probably lose sometimes, right? You know, sometimes you're maybe shocked that the employers have pretty much taken advantage of labor, and it's going to stay that way for the next 10 years in the agreement. And you have to, you know, it's like all of us have failures in our, not to say that you would be a failure, but we wish something would grow and develop, and it hasn't. And so, yeah, I'm just asking if you have any examples of justice that you wish was there.
Well, sometimes I'll see people agree to something and it's either side that is not in their best interest. Just because they're worn out and they want to get the deal done. And then we're back 3 years later. You mediated this deal sucked. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Time out. You know, that wasn't me. That was your agreement.
Yeah.
But if you're going to agree, I can't tell you not to agree with it.
Right.
But when all else fails, blame the mediator.
Sure.
You know, that's what happened with baseball. That's why our agency didn't get involved with baseball. Almost 30 years ago, they had a bad experience with a mediator. So mediation sucks. And that's not true. I mean, you agreed to what you agreed to. You can take my suggestions or my food for thought, or you can discard them. It's up to you. But a lot of people, as with life in many instances, people want to escape the choices or the consequences of the choices they make.
Thanks for your trying to make it just.
Any additional comments or questions?
Yeah, that's what I'm just, I can imagine that it's difficult working as a government entity, trying to utilize the just wage framework when there are conversations historically of like US government not utilizing dignity in the most pronounced way. And so what does that feel like then, kind of being that employee, kind of, I would imagine, kind of feeling like you're pushed into a corner a little bit of your framework and pedagogy being in conflict at times. Or maybe you don't feel that way, but.
I never feel conflicted. All right, my approach is my approach. And so I've kind of resigned myself to affect the things that I can affect. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not making the Kool-Aid that they want us to drink. All right. But I'm making my own Kool-Aid and doing my job the best way I know how. Because I am employed by the agency, but I am in service to my clients. So are there incongruities that bother me? Just like we see here. There are incongruities that bother us. But that still doesn't dissuade us from pressing forward and being who we are and doing what we need to do to serve the people that we're here to serve. Well, that's all I have. Unless you guys, did I bring it in under the wire?
Yeah, we've got a few minutes. We're plotting your punctuality, but we do have a few more minutes if anybody has any other questions or comments.
Well, maybe if Kevin has time, people can hang around.
Yeah, that is
Yeah, I have time.
That as well.
Those who need to.
I'll ask you a question there, Ken.
Yeah, Dave.
And I may be late, I am late, class, and you made a address that said we have to tell me. So when I was a young lawyer, this is part of the collective bargaining framework, but in settling cases, I was representing management or representing a corporation.
Mhm.
And I remember being frustrated as a second or third year lawyer about the amount of time seemingly wasted effort in trying to reach a settlement of the case. And I went to a continuing legal education seminar on negotiations, where essentially the message was, you have to go through the dance. I always wanted to cut to the chase, and I would tell the more senior lawyer at the time, can't we put this, not waste our time, let's just sit down. No, you can't do that. You have to go through the dance. I mean, is that your experience? And you may have already addressed that, so I apologize for that, but that was a message of a young lawyer that, I'm sorry, you just have to go through the dance of negotiation. You can't cut to the chase. It seems so inefficient and wasteful.
A labor agreement is a relationship. So if you look at it in that way, to cultivate a relationship, it takes time. It takes an investment of time and in getting to know the other party. And so when you start the music in negotiations, it's like you're dating Dorothy. You didn't go, hey, straight, let's get married. You took your time, right? And so the same applies to collective bargaining. Yeah, that's the simplest way, most efficient way I can tell you. So, and because people aren't ready, if you pop the question too soon, well, maybe that wasn't the issue, but if you if you pop the question too, with my wife, I know if I pop the question too soon, she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready. I had to wait for the right time, the right moment within myself, and also looking at her. And so that's the investment in the relationship, because you could say, this is a reasonable place for the deal to land. Can't you see it? And they're like, no, because this is the place where I think the deal should land. Can't you see it? And so we have to whittle that away by going through the dance.
Well, some of that just the need to be heard, even if you know you're not gonna, that's not gonna land, right? That maybe you don't have enough chances to just express yourself, and that this is a dedicated time to just to express and to this is both what I want and what I need, and I'm not gonna get it all, but I still need to just say it to you.
That is an incredible insight, and I see it most often in grievance mediation. Everybody knows what a grievance is, right? All right. So in a grievance mediation, I will ask the moving party, which is most often the employee, what do you need to resolve this issue? And I say, I just need them to hear me. I need them to see me. I need them to know what's in my heart. I don't want any money. I want to feel respected and seen as a human being. I can't tell you how many of those over the last 19 years I've had. And then the difficulty they have is I haven't been seen, I haven't been heard, I haven't been respected. How do I put a dollar figure to that for a broken heart? That's a great question.
Kind of more, not logistics, but since 6% of the American workforce is under collective bargaining, how big is your organization? How many mediators there are? How often do you get involved? How many cases are there a year?
That's a lot of questions, Dan.
There are less than 200 mediators around the country. Around 200 in our agency. So to answer your question, we can be pretty busy, with just 6% when you have around 150 mediators in the agency. So we're small, we're intimate.
Are you unionized?
Mediators are not. That's all I can say. But our office and administrative staff is. It's just a different classification. So, but we do have a committee that is comprised of labor and management, that they call it the Partnership Council, that meets quarterly to talk about concerns. And that seems to be working well. So that's encouraging.
I have to teach, so I gotta go.
Yeah, that's good. So as far as the number of cases, what we're doing, we're trying to move away. We used to count the cases, like, and not even the amount of cases, it's how many meetings you have a year. Is it 200 meetings you have a year? Is it, what's the minimum, what's the maximum? And basically, what we're trying to do is make sure that people are busy and focused, and what's the quality of what we're doing versus the quantity. Thank you. So we're moving away from a hard and fast number to do that, but you can imagine, the millions of people that are in unions.
Well, thank you so much again, Kevin. Please join me in thanking Kevin again for his time.